Good morning. Today is Thursday. It is, what day is today anyway? This is November 3rd. And I'm going to do two of these quickly back to back because they're pretty hand in hand with one another. Instead of doing it in one large one, I'll just cut it up into two smaller episodes so I can just give you a couple points of view from me on these as they happen. So, without further ado, let's talk about Stephen King and The Green Mile. Now, this book came out, it started to come out back in 1995, and it's one of those things where, Stephen King as a writer has been around since the 70s. The guy churns out novels and churns out stories faster than you can imagine. I can pretty confidently say that a lot of his work is not ghostwritten, that he's actually doing the writing on everything. Um, and it's just amazing that he can just crank it and crank it and crank it out there and give you new novels all the time. There are some things that do happen though, is when you have so many books being published by yourself, you will hit upon the same topics over and over again. And that's just because, they say you write what you know, and maybe he takes a certain path with one story and then wonders, if I branched in that direction, what would have happened? And he creates a similar setting, and then that happens as well. In some of the earlier work that when I was a teenager reading, I noticed that, for instance, I think if you read The Tommyknockers and you read The Stand, you do get a sense of, and actually, if you Needful Things is another one. He always has that little town in Maine, and there's so many people that he will introduce you to, but like half the town hates the other half of the town. And sometimes they're just so diametrically opposite. Like, for instance, there might be a priest, and then there'll be a reverend of another parish. And of course, because they're hating God from different directions, they hate each other for some reason. And then there's, the person who owns the store and the person who owns the gas station might not like each other, and yada yada. He also has the recurring theme back then of there might be a person, either a child or an adult, that has a handicap of some fashion, and maybe they say a word over and over again. It's just one of their ticks of their things. Well, that word is going to be very important later on in the story. So, for instance, you look at The Stand, and it's MOON is something that I think it was Edward Cullen, or could be wrong, but one of the characters kept saying over and over again, who had a mental disability. And of course, later on, the moon becomes like what he needs to look at in order to take a plan and bring it to its next fruition. But I digress. So, another thing that recurs a lot with Stephen King is the book about the writer. A writer, and then this happens to it, and then there's at least a dozen writer centric novels out there. Misery is one of them. The Dark Half is another one, and like I said, it can keep on going and going and going. I do not have his whole bibliography to memory, but it's just one of those things. So, why even bother to mention all that? Because he has so much going on all the time, it's not surprising that he would try other media or try different things with his books and his novels. Things that will just, keep himself sharp, see if he can change with the times. Sometimes even bring back old things from the past. And I think that's one of the things that was done here with The Green Mile. So with The Green Mile, it actually got delivered to bookstores in a serialized format. So if you look, the books are very thin. We're talking like 80 pages, give or take. And they actually came out this way, and they came out this way, over time. One, two, three, four, five, six. So over six periods, I don't want to say months because I don't remember if it did come out one a month, but over six periods, it would hit the shelf with a new volume, and people would absorb that and then wait until the next one came on. It's actually very reminiscent of how even some of the older popular writers used to get their new work out onto the shelves. On this channel, I have a lot of audiobooks that I've recorded. And I try to do things that are in the public domain of the United States, which means they have to be out of the um, copyright laws for 95 years. There's actually another website out here called LibriVox that I've been assisting by being a contributor to that as well. So if people like Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare and Edgar Rice Burroughs and Jules Verne, they're old enough that no one owns the original stuff any longer, and anyone can actually do their own audiobooks. I can actually, if I wanted to, take some of those stories and probably leather bind it and sell it myself if I wanted to, because no one owns the copyright. One of the biggest stories I usually tell is it's things like Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is old enough, it's out of copyright, so I can go and do something with Wizard of Oz. However, MGM Studios, when they made the film version of it, when colorization was brand new, they had Dorothy wearing the ruby slippers because that red really popped onto the screen and people loved it. Well, in the original story, the slippers are made of silver. They're not made of rubies. So I couldn't use the ruby slippers unless that's in the public domain. But the original story with the silver slippers, I am allowed to use. So copyrights can become very interesting whether or not you change something that is patentable or whatever, copyrightable to you. Again, why do I say this? Edgar Rice Burroughs, who I'm a fan of, when he started having his stories coming out way back when, it wasn't just straight to book for the most part. A lot of times it came out in magazines. Magazines were very popular back then. It wasn't, you didn't have a Barnes and Noble, you didn't have the internet. So, for instance, I have a story on here called The Bandit of Hell's Bend. And he wrote this in a magazine called the Argosy All Weekly. And it came out over 6 subsequent issues. So you have to buy 6 weeks worth of issues in order to get the full brand new story. And that's how people did it back then. And while you picked up an issue of Argosy, you would get a portion of this new story, and there are probably another 3 or 4 stories in the magazine as well. So you're following things as they change over time from period to period to period. When I was a younger person collecting comic books, I was a big fan of Wolverine and Marvel, and they had Marvel Comics Presents. And Wolverine was a main character in that. So in the first 10 issues, he had a story arc. I mean, it was 8 issues. He had a story arc that lasted all those. But there was 3 other stories in every single magazine. Some would be one-offs and one-shots, and then some would have 4 or 5 issues as well. And with good marketing, you might have him be 1 through 8 and start another person's story in a background story at 7. And that might go from 7 to 14. So if you get caught up in the one story, you have to keep getting the other issues to finalize the backup story. Meanwhile, the front story has a new arc that's going to last however long it's going to last too. So those things are pretty interesting. So the Green Mile originally came out in these small versions. Again, each one of these is pretty small. You can probably knock these out in 2 hours if you wanted to just read it all in one sitting. And it was a new thing for him to try out. And I gotta say, I believe it's very successful for him. So, but how does that work when you're actually writing a novel? Because you would need to have your novel tailored to a serial format in order for the books to be standalone enough that someone picking it up can get a start and an ending to a tale, but also have it building from the past towards the future as you're getting into like books 3, 4, 5. So I think he did a good job with this one too. I mean, all told, over the 6 books, I mean, this is a rather thick paperback. This is all paperback editions right now. And you got to figure if each one of them is about 80 pages long, this is just shy of like 500 pages, which to Stephen King is not out of the realm at all. This is kind of his standard thing. But how many people would normally buy a paperback of this size off the rack? Interestingly enough, too, is the pricing on it. So each one of these goes for about $3 at the time. I'm not going to give you an inflationary adjusted price here, I'm sorry, but they're about $3 at a time. And of course, it's funny, 1 through 5 might be $3, but then the last one always takes you for a little bit extra. That's $4. So this is $19 for a paperback right here, which generally, if you're looking at a new hardcover of this size, might be closer to $25, $29. And the paperback versions usually go for a little bit less than this. So I think that marketing wise, it's more successful for them with this. But for the fans, you get to see one story as it progresses slowly and slowly. With the Green Mile, he was able to actually break this down into subsections enough to be interesting to read standalone and for the whole story, like I mentioned before. So, first of all, he starts out with the two dead girls. This talks about the crime that occurred where two girls were killed, and they have a suspect who's on death row, and death row is actually the Green Mile itself. By the way, these books have been out for 25 years or so. There might be some spoilers in here, but if you haven't even seen the movie, you might want to turn off now. Otherwise, let's just talk about this a little bit. So, this sets up the crime, why the person's there, introduces the characters, you learn about the time, the era, why this might have happened, and whatever else. And as the guards get used to this new prisoner, who's very large and very gigantic man, you kind of see what their trepidations are of, hey, if this guy wants to start something, how are we going to restrain him? How are we going to hold him back? Then it moves on to the next one with the Mouse on the Mile, which does talk about a little rodent who they end up calling Mr. Jangles, and he's on the Green Mile as, a visitor. Obviously, they're not trying to put a mouse to death. But the guards don't care about him because he's actually keeping the other inmates in line as far as they're entertained, they're quiet, they're sedate. It's fine. Let's just keep everything all nice and happy. But he's got a little story behind it. And the person who's kind of like using him as a pet, and what his role is, and how it will be important maybe later on. As things progress, you get to Coffee's hands. Coffee is the man who is on death row in this novel, and then Mr. Jangles actually has an appearance here because he's very important, because you suddenly learn that this inmate, this gentle giant that's on death row, has a supernatural ability. So how is that going to play into everything else is going to be a question, but you see how this actually occurs on its own as part of the larger story. The bad death of Edward Delacroix, there's an antagonist the whole way that has been causing problems. And you get a lot of his backstory, he gets his comeuppance, there is a lot going on here that it has its own standalone novel that is part of this universe, and it fits the serialized format very well. Getting towards the ending, we go into Night Journey, where there's actually a plan by the inmates to help out this, a plan by the guards to help out this inmate with his ability and how he's going to assist someone else outside the prison with the ability. Until finally we get to death row and everything that's going to occur there. It gets to wrap up the story. You see how the characters are going. You see what happens to the characters afterwards. There's a long epilogue in here as well. And, it finalizes. It's a very good story. So, there you have it. This was a very interesting way to publish a book in novelization form, serialized. It brought back the old way that they did it in, like I said, this is turn of the century. Like I said, Edgar Rice Burroughs, all his stuff came out in that fashion. I even have another one from Edgar Rice Burroughs out here, which came out in 6 issues of a newspaper, over 6 different editions of the newspaper. So it's nice to see if this stuff can actually come back. Unfortunately, we do live in a day where print is kind of dead to a certain extent. People like going online, they want to listen to things more, but wouldn't mind seeing these type of magazines come back again. So, got to thank him for doing that. And on that note, this is going to bring me right into my next episode, so let me wrap up here and start over there. Thank you very much.